The fourth commandment, according to Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11, reads, "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male and female slaves, or your cattle, or the stranger who is within your settlements. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and the sea, and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day and hallowed it." But when this commandment is repeated in Deuteronomy chapter 5, the reason given for observing the Sabbath has nothing to do with the creation story. Nothing so grand or cosmic is the origin of this sacred law. Instead, Yahweh states, "Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God freed you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm." What does captivity in Egypt and escape have to do with the Sabbath? Nothing at all. So why the change? These two versions of the same passage perfectly illustrate the difference in thinking between First Temple Theology and Second Temple. One is concerned with universal constants and cosmic creation, with purifying the whole of the earth, while the other seeks to replace it with tales of a pseudo-history and concerns itself with the possession of land. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. This episode is part of a mini-series concerning a profound shift in theology in ancient Israel. If you haven't already listened to episodes 34 and 35, go back and do that now. This is a direct continuation, and without the information from the previous two episodes, you probably won't fully grasp the content here. And yes, I am aware that one of those is the Christmas episode. Trust me, you'll understand why that episode is important by the time you finish this one. The point of all of this is to establish a better understanding of the religion and beliefs of the ancient Israelites prior to the Babylonian exile and the subsequent Deuteronomic reform. Now, this is not an in-depth look at the ancient cult, but an overview so that you can better understand the change that would occur after the exile ended. You can't fully understand the implications of the changes without first learning what was being replaced. Still with me? Let's get started. As we discussed in the last episode, creation was a written, everlasting covenant. See Psalm 45:7, or just half of episode 35. The everlasting covenant concerns not only creation, but the remission of sins. But the perfect creation was corrupted by the fallen angels, and these transgressions against the ancient covenant caused creation to wither and fall apart. See Isaiah 24, 4-6. But according to the Deuteronomic history, breaking the covenant causes only the dispossession of the land. That's the entire point of the book of Judges. This is one of the primary changes made by the Deuteronomists. Possession of land was central to their ideology because they were in the middle of a land dispute with the First Temple cult. But more on that later. Jeremiah 31, 35-36 mentions this covenant. Here, a set of laws governing the movement of the moon is written by Yahweh Sabaoth, and the end of the universe is directly linked with the end of the people of Israel. The holy people and their promise to help maintain the written covenant is crucial in maintaining the integrity of the universe. This isn't about losing property, but about losing all of creation. Again, the difference in concern between First and Second Temple is of magnitude. The Second Temple concerns itself with property ownership, while the chief concern of the first is cosmic. Creation was sealed with the eternal covenant, and those bonds are depicted in 1 Enoch 69, 16-20, as a great oath which holds the waters of the oceans in place. suspends the heavens and the sky, guides the flow of rivers, creates the seas, sends the sun and moon along their course across the sky, and determines the movements of the stars. Beginning with the greatness of the heavens before the world was even created, and ending with such mundane things as rain and dew, all of creation exists in accordance with this great oath, a written covenant. But this covenant, and thus creation, was corrupted by fallen angels who sought to destroy all of creation. Much of Enoch deals with this specific topic. The angels, which had been cast down, were unable to unravel creation because they lacked something important. They lacked something crucial in breaking the seals of creation. According to Enoch, they did not possess the sacred name, which was one of these seals. Because of this, they had to settle for corruption instead of destruction. And where was this sacred covenant written? One place was inside the Holy of Holies, which was also the only place where, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would speak aloud the sacred and secret name. Because this name was so sacred, it was forbidden for use outside the Holy of Holies. And as we covered in the last episode, the Holy of Holies was representative of the first day of creation, when Yahweh came into being. So just as Yahweh appears on day one as the agent of creation, so too does his sacred name appear here as a seal against its destruction. And it is in this role as a defender of creation that Yahweh rises to prominence. We've already seen that Yahweh was a steward of Israel, as mentioned in Deuteronomy 32 8 through 9, when his father, El Elyon, divides the earth into different nations and gives Israel to Yahweh, or Psalm 2 6 through 7, when the king of Israel is set upon the hill of Zion and named the Son of God. And we've seen numerous references to divine kings, such as Isaiah 14 24 33, the aforementioned Psalm 2, and Psalm 82. But what exactly was the role of this divine king? In a way, it all comes down to fertility. Ancient kings were strongly linked with fertility of the people, the crops, and their nations as a whole. Psalm 72 is a perfect example of this, linking the king with the sun, rain, grass, and tying the prosperity of the nation with the king's humility and good judgment. And let's not forget Solomon, a fictive king meant to represent the old divine royals and his 700 wives and 300 concubines. All ancient kings were linked with fertility. Babylon and Canaan both had similar practices in their own royal cults, including rituals which had the king humbled and brought low, and then later being raised up again. These were nature renewal festivals which represented the solar cycle, with the king playing the role of the sun in midwinter when the nights grow long and darkness rules, but eventually the light returns, bringing with it fertility and life. The king's sacrifice was meant to guarantee the return of the sun, just as we discussed in episode 34, the Christmas episode. Part of these rituals was a scene in which the king would enter the temple and there ascend to heaven to view sacred tablets. Information concerning the past and future were usually written on these, as well as a law code or covenant. Moses ascending Sinai was, like so many other scenes in the Old Testament, a historical replacement for divine right which was practiced by the old royal cult. Where once laws came from divine kings, now they came from a single man who leads people out of exile. As heavenly beings, the ancient kings held divine power. Apart from bringing rain to the crops and preventing floods, they had angelic knowledge, as referenced in 2 Samuel 14:17, or the power to cure leprosy, as seen in 2 Kings 5:6. And since the king of Israel was the earthly incarnation of Yahweh, he had the power to control the forces of nature. Baal defeated Yam, and Marduk defeated Tiamat. So too does Yahweh, the steward of Israel, defeat Leviathan, the embodiment of the chaotic waters of the ocean. The book of Daniel is filled with kings struggling against beasts, floods, hostile waters, and strongly links kings with angels, the sons of El Elyon. And Exodus 15, the Song of the Sea, was a royal hymn celebrating the triumph of Yahweh, the King of Israel, over the chaotic waters and the primordial sea beasts. It has no place in the Moses narrative, as it doesn't even mention Moses or the recent events which it supposedly praises. And so, while Deuteronomy 11:13 claims that rain comes from keeping the commandments, Hosea comes to terms with the older Baal cult and the connected Yahweh cult, which link the king with control over the rains and waters. In these nature renewal festivals, a king representing a god of rain and grain, such as Baal or Yahweh, would have ritual intercourse with a priestess who represented an earth goddess. This was symbolic of the clouds, weather, god king, bringing fertility, rain, or semen to the nation, earth, or womb. As with the previous episode, one thing represents several: nation, soil, people. It's all about bringing them prosperity through the power of the God King. Now, we're not sure how big a role ritual intercourse played in the royal cult, as most references have been expunged. But considering how often fertility is mentioned in conjunction with the kings, how many wives Solomon is said to have had, or how big a role intercourse plays in the Davidic tales, I think it's safe to assume the practice was alive and well in the First Temple. The Jerusalem Autumn Renewal Festival was bound up with this imagery. 1 Enoch 10 and 1 Enoch 80 establishes a pattern of judgment, knowledge, and fertility. This gave rise to divine judgment being represented as a harvest, something which persists into modern times with Christianity. And in the book of Isaiah, every single time that Isaiah mentions fertility, it is in the context of divine judgment. This judgment will show up again in an upcoming episode in which I discuss the characters Jesus and Barabbas. Spoiler alert, Jesus is not who you think he is. The transformation of the king into Yahweh occurs on the Day of Atonement inside the temple, and in his celestial form, he's supposed to be hidden inside the Holy of Holies. But one scene in Psalm 63:2 has a temple worker peeking behind the curtain and spotting him. And speaking of the temple, we need to address its role in all of this. As stated before, the security of Israel was part of the fixed order of creation, and its existence was linked with the safety of the universe. Now, how exactly does this work? According to some texts, the temple was a capstone that plugged a fountain that led to the Tehom, the subterranean ocean upon which the world rested. One midrash has David digging into the stone and accidentally breaking through, allowing water to erupt from the ground. The temple plugged the primordial waters, securing creation from their destructive power. So it's another symbol of Yahweh's triumph over the chaotic waters. 1 Enoch 69:19 tells how the covenant set creation in place and bound the Tehom, trapping it and holding it in place. Now, when is that covenant first mentioned? After the floodwaters of the Tehom have destroyed the earth, and then were contained once more in the story of Noah. And if you recall the purpose of that flood from episode 7, it dealt with purging the fallen angels and the Nephilim from creation, another instance where the everlasting covenant deals with the atonement of sin. Whenever this covenant was breached, the high priest was tasked with repairing that breach, like Phinehas using a spear to kill the couple who broke the covenant in Numbers 25, a breach which caused a plague to befall the Israelites. And Isaiah 24:4-6 tells us that the created work is falling to ruin because of transgressions against the everlasting covenant. Throughout the scriptures, writers who were sympathetic to the First Temple theology, they view creation as a fragile construct which is under constant threat from the corruption of evil, and that evil originated not with a disobedient man in a garden or a group of refugees wandering in the desert who bowed before a golden calf, but from fallen angels and the corrupt knowledge they gave to humanity. Because of this, because corruption threatens the entire world must be cleansed of that corruption. It must be purged of evil. Sin must be placed back where it belongs, with the fallen angels, and the creation must be made pure again. So, how can one man, even a king who fancies himself a god, accomplish this? The world is a vast place, after all. It simply can't be done. But suppose that one thing can be another. Suppose that a temple is also the whole of creation. Just as a king could be brought low and then raised up again, thus bringing the sun low in the winter sky and raising it up again in the springtime, a temple could be cleansed through a complex ritual performed by a king, and the same would happen to the entire world through the power of a god. And now, with the context made clear and the stage set, we finally reached the topic of this episode: the Atonement. In the First Temple, the Day of Atonement was the most important ritual, but it would be replaced by the Deuteronomist with the Passover. The central theme was one man, the king and high priest, making atonement for the sins of the entire nation. This idea, which was crucial in the First Temple theology, was outright rejected by the Second Temple. An argument against atonement theology is seen in Exodus 32, when Moses mistakenly holds to the old belief and ascends Mount Sinai to offer atonement for the sins of Israel. He is rejected by Yahweh because now one man cannot make atonement for another. The entire purpose of the original temple and its central ritual are rejected in a single sentence. The new blood sacrifice of Passover must be made by each family. Personal responsibility for appeasing Yahweh has entered their theology for the first time. The cosmic concerns of atonement have been replaced by a fictive historical event, just as the reason for keeping the Sabbath has been changed in the same manner. In the sacrifice of atonement, the king, who is both the high priest and Yahweh, the steward of Israel, is brought low. It's a reenactment of the solar cycle and Yahweh's battle with the primordial forces of chaos. Throughout the Psalms, we find the phrase, "Arise, O Yahweh," usually in the context of a prayer or invocation, asking for aid in defeating some enemy. But how could an all-powerful God be brought low and then arise to battle an enemy? In one such psalm concerning the deliverance from enemies, Psalm 18, we read the exclamatory, "Yahweh lives." Unless he's a dying and rising God, this should never be in question. Yahweh would always be alive. But I think Yahweh did die in his battle with Leviathan, just as Baal and Marduk died in their parallel battles with the great water dragons, only to be resurrected. Their deaths were mourned by female gods in their respective pantheons, and eventually they were resurrected to bring new life. But more on that later. It seems that Yahweh's life story resembles that of Baal-Hadad, the other Canaanite rain and grain god whom Yahweh replaced. And it might be pertinent to mention here that, according to text unearthed in Ugarit, El says, "My son will be called Yah," one of the variants on the name Yahweh that we find throughout Palestine. So the ancient Canaanites seem to believe that Yahweh was Baal. And in the book Hosea, we read from Yahweh, "You will no longer call me Baal." So the Israelites, understood the two gods to be the same as well, only the title gradually changed. But let's move on. The king or high priest, who is the earthly representation of Yahweh, is stripped of his vestments. We see references to this in the Torah, as the high priest must be stripped and prepared before entering the Holy of Holies. Incense is burned, filling the place with smoke. A pseudo-historical replacement for this is Moses ascending the mountain and entering the cloud of smoke. The king, brought low and stripped of his power and robes, represents the forces of nature at their weakest when the darkness holds sway. The ritual involves splashing of blood around the temple. If you recall episode 22, entitled Flesh Hooks, you'll remember this gruesome part. The purpose of the blood sacrifice is to purify the temple and make atonement for the people of Israel. This purifying blood is splashed around the temple because the temple is creation. The priest isn't just purifying the building, he's purifying the world. He's trying to repair the corrupted creation that was damaged by the fallen angels. The stripped king is the dying and rising Yahweh, the champion who succumbs to the forces of chaos only to rise again triumphant. Arise, O Yahweh. Yahweh lives. It's a perfect parallel to the Zagmuk tradition in Babylon that serves the exact same purpose, the renewal of nature through the self-sacrifice of the king. But all great rituals require a true sacrifice. Something must die. In Zagmuk, a replacement king was offered. But in ancient Israel, it was an animal. This is where the two goats come in. Two goats are brought to the temple. They're identical because First Temple Theology is all about connections. The first goat is deemed pure and is sacrificed for Yahweh, though the word here can be translated to mean as Yahweh, meaning the goat could very well symbolize the deity himself, which, considering the context, would make perfect sense. The goat is then killed, his blood spilled, and the choicest parts are eaten by the priests. Consuming the goat, which is linked with Yahweh, provides a stronger link between the priest king and the deity. And if you're seeing a parallel with the Christian rite of communion, then you're beginning to understand where all this is heading. So the goat, which is either sacrificed for Yahweh or as Yahweh, is partially eaten by the priest, providing a strong link with the deity. Blood is splashed around the temple, which is the world, to gather up all the sin. And some of that animal blood is smeared on the second goat, which still lives. This purifying blood of Yahweh has now gathered up all the evil and transferred it onto the second goat. This second goat is taken to a steep cliff and tossed over. But it's not just any cliff. This cliff overlooks the valley where the fallen angel Azazel is imprisoned. The goat is sacrificed for Azazel, or the goat is Azazel. Again, the word can hold either meaning. So the sin has all been gathered up and placed back where it belongs, in the pit where Azazel lies imprisoned until the final judgment. This sacrifice of the king repairs the damaged world and restores fertility to the land. It's why fertility is so strongly linked with judgment in so many passages in books sympathetic to First Temple Theology, such as Isaiah. The king and the goat, which are stand-ins for Yahweh, are judged pure, and that sacrifice is set to purify creation. But this king survives and he arises just as the sun begins climbing again after the winter solstice. If you read the book of Enoch, you'll see that resurrection and ascension were thought of as the same thing. Resurrection wasn't something that happened when you actually died, but when a mortal man became an angel. Enoch undergoes the same transformation of the king and becomes a celestial being. He is then enthroned, just as the priest king, who now wears the sacred name of Yahweh on his forehead, a symbol of his new identity, is enthroned, as we see in Psalm 2, Psalm 110, and Isaiah 9:6. But they saw this repair to the covenant as temporary. It had to be done annually and would require a great sacrifice to make it permanent. This was seen as the Messianic age, a future they awaited. Of course, all of this only makes sense if, once upon a time, the ancient Israelites believed that Yahweh was a dying and rising God. Now, as we've seen with characters like Samson, the stories of deities, which are too important to discard, sometimes become historicized. Gods become men, and annual events which mirror the workings of the heavens become one-time historical occurrences. But if Yahweh died when fighting Leviathan, before the myths were historicized, there should be some mention of it. Some story about a hero who is brought low, who struggles with turbulent waters, descends into darkness, is swallowed by a giant sea monster, is presumed dead, stays in its belly for 3 days to mirror the descent of the sun at winter solstice, only to emerge alive again from the great beast at the end of the story, and then be seen as a man of righteousness. He might even seek shade beneath a tree, as we see of Yahweh in the Eden story. But where in the Bible would we possibly find such a story about some man swallowed whole by a giant fish? This ancient theology, the belief in divine kings who were the earthly incarnations of heavenly beings, the role of the temple as an earthly duplicate of the mountain palace of the gods and the cosmos itself, and the annual atonement ritual to renew creation would eventually come to an end. It was difficult to see the temple as the axis mundi when it had so easily been destroyed by their enemies. Couple that with the fact that the returning exiles had lived for decades completely separated from their native religion and their all-important temple, surrounded by alien beliefs, and you can see how the ground is now fertile for a new belief system, one which takes into account the idea that the chosen people can be easily dispossessed of their land, and the divine royals, which are now absent, are no longer needed. The books of Kings describes a back and forth struggle to implement and maintain a new theology. This was the time of the Deuteronomic reform, when a clash of ideas disrupted the reunion of long-separated relatives so recently returned from captivity. During this reform, prophets spoke of the introduction of alien theology, which they referred to as foreign wisdom, which was coming to Jerusalem, Isaiah 2:6, which misleads the people, Isaiah 3:12, and so the First Temple cult was exiled by their own kinsmen. But where did this foreign theology come from? Some were ideas which came from the northern kingdom of Israel after the Assyrian conquest, and some of them came from Babylon. But perhaps the greatest influence came from the new owners of the land, owners who had so recently defeated Babylon, installed a puppet governor in Jerusalem, and financed the construction of the Second Temple. An empire that wouldn't tolerate the presence of divine kings, which preached personal responsibility and worshipped only one God. I'll be going into more detail on the influence of this new religion soon, but in order to fully understand their influence, I'll first have to properly introduce this monotheistic religion. So my next episode will be devoted entirely to the prophet Zarathustra and the religion of Zoroastrianism. That about wraps it up for this episode. If you found this helpful, leave a good review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. Like us on Facebook at facebook.com/dragonsandgenesis. Check out the website at dragonsandgenesis.com, where you can find a list of resources to help you better understand the Bible. And also send me any questions or comments, which will be addressed in future episodes. And as always, thank you for listening.